Hey everybody, this is Joan for MTG Nexus doing our wrap up of week number 2 of our 50 decks in 50 weeks. Starting out this time in Pioneer with Mono Red Midrange, Chonky Red, whatever you wish to call it. As a friendly reminder, if you like what you're seeing on the channel, please consider subscribing, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below as we aim to become the most informative Modern and Pioneer channel on the YouTubes. So this was a list we first played about a week ago. So this was a good starting point, I think, to kind of identify some of the issues, some of the factors, some of the things you have to consider when you're tuning your mono red list. Ironically, it actually starts with the mana base. So you think a mono red, monocolored mana base isn't that difficult, but you don't want to pack it with just 25 mountains. One of the powers of playing a monocolored deck, specifically in Pioneer, is the utility you get out of your lands. This particular version chose to play Mutavaults, Remnant Ruins, Castle Embereth, all of which are fine. The one thing to point out, though, is 4 Mutavaults is not necessarily a combo with Goblin Chain Whirler. This does make it a little bit less likely for you to hit red, red, red on turn 3. Obviously, Goblin Chain Whirler is at its best when you can do that. So that's kind of the first thing you have to consider. And as we discuss the various different iterations of decks, we'll kind of cover, how different decks are adapting to whether either playing Goblin Chain Whirler or playing another deck or another card in this particular slot. Beyond that, a lot of the things are the same. Soulscar Mages, Kari Zevs, those seem to be the de facto 1 and 2 drops. There aren't too many other cards you consider. Monastery Swiftspear isn't particularly good in this build because it is mostly creatures. You could play something like Archshaker Kenra in the 2-drop slot. I'm still not 100% sure why Kari Zev specifically has been the one that's kind of emerged. I mean, it is a nice start on its own, but it doesn't have haste or anything. So I am curious as to the origin or why Kari Zev ended up becoming the primary weapon of choice. Beyond that, 4 Wild Slash, 4 Lightning Strike, kind of the key things. Those kind of help you leverage against early 1-drop creatures out of your opponent's aggressive decks, or allows you to go face or, finish off something like a Fairy Time Raveler or any of that kind of nonsense in the early turns after they bounce one of your creatures. Beyond that, Bone Crusher Giant, it slices, it dices, it's a shock, prevents damage. Has damage prevention, it's a 4/3 that they have to take 2 damage to kill with a spell. Rabble Master, this card is either very good or very mediocre. Your opponent's playing a ton of removal. Can be hard to get this card off the ground, and especially being on the draw and aggressive mirrors. This card tends to come out a lot, but the upside of having this card against decks like Blue-White Control in the main deck is just kind of second to none in those style of matchups. Goblin Chain Whirler, this card is not quite as good as it was in Standard and such, but it does serve a couple purposes. One, allows you to take out a bunch of X1s, be it Mana Dorks, be it X1s out of black, mono black aggro. This card in those 2 particular style of matchups, it serves that kind of interesting purpose. But against a lot of the decks we were running into, like Niv to Light and other things, it's kind of a mediocre mid-range beater that kind of occasionally is able to punk out things like Teferi Time Raveler and such. So it can be a worthwhile card. It's just there actually is some debate whether 4 Mutavault 0 of these is correct. Like some to run 2 Mutavaults and 4 Whirlers. The only other cards that you can consider are like Rampaging Frostodon. That card will cover in another sideboard. Actually, in this sideboard too. Scab Clan Berserker. But I think they functionally serve different roles, so I honestly think this is the better main deck card. The 4-drop slot, Chandra is kind of the de facto one in every list. The first list we played here had 1 Hazoret and the main 1 Hazoret on the board. Other cards that you can be in this build can be like Torbrand, Rekindling Phoenix. The thing with Hazoret Hazoret's a resilient threat, but it's sometimes hard for you to empty your hand, especially in the mid game, to turn this into a successful racer. So I think Hazoret actually might be the weakest of the three, and the Fallout versions we played, we did not revisit Hazoret. 3 Glorybringer. I honestly think this, outside of Chandra, might be the best card in the deck. In a lot of matchups, especially the mid-range mirrors, where you're able to Doomblade something plus get in for 4 damage. Sometimes you're able to kill a creature and kill a planeswalker. And the final card was this like one of Embercleave that a lot of versions left it in, and I kind of agree with a few streamers and such that just this card just feels not so great when you're not running Legion Warboss. Like I believe the original list did, kind of similar to the Gruul decks. So the wider you're able to go, the better off Embercleave is, and oftentimes you're not able to go wide. And to that end, things like Castle Embereth are very good at helping your go wide strategy, as well as Torbran, and I just don't think Embercleave has a particular spot in this deck. Beyond that, removal spells you have, the auxiliary threats you have, the graveyard hate, they're all kind of different things. Tormod's Crypt obviously can come down turn 1, turn 2, disrupt your Lotus Field combo decks, or Dredgeless Dredge, etc. The other alternative being Leyline of the Void primarily. Chandra's Defeat, kind of a necessary evil for the mono red mirrors. A Braid, this card is pretty good when you're expecting artifacts of any kind, so like Is It and Soul and such. It was good in certain spots when we played against that deck, but I think overall having some of the other cards is a little bit better. Fry, I didn't realize how valuable this card would be in a lot of matchups. We played several different heroic variants. We played against Blue-White Control. We played against Niv to Light, where these all have relevant targets like Siege Rhinos, Feather, etc. Mizian Mortars, this card does have the upside of being able to overload, but I honestly think something like Lava Coil is just better. Damping Sphere, much again, can come in against certain matchups like Lotus Field, etc. Scab Clan Berserker, some people are playing things like Eidolon and the Great Revel. I think Eidolon is... I really don't know. I didn't get a chance to test Eidolon, and it was just recently popping up on lists. But Scab Clan felt like there were some spots where it's good, but there were other spots that was kind of eh. I think Eidolon coming down a turn earlier, whether that offsets the haste or not, and not damaging you yourself. Kind of hard to say which one is superior. That would be something else you would need to further test. And then Dog Bomb here, pretty nice card, but once again, I do think Rekindling Phoenix and Torbran are just better at what we're trying to do in kind of the grindier matchups. Okay, hop back into Little Red. We'll come back in 1 second. Another deck we took a look at was the little brother of Chonky Red, Mono Red Aggro. This version is trying to leverage a lower to the ground, burn or prowess strategy. Things like Monastery Swiftspear, things like Soulscar Mage, 20 lands, doing things like Wizard's Lightning, Searing Blood, Bone Crusher Giant, Eidolon the Great Revel. Using things like Shock, also a little bit leverage, and then using things like Light Up the Stage and Skewer the Critics in this build, but Bone Crusher Giant also comes in handy, quite handy in this build. This deck is a little bit lower to the ground, a little bit more capable of racing and killing things like Blue-White Control, maybe Lotus Field combo, etc. It probably has a little bit slightly faster Goldfish than the mid-range version. But the problem comes up, the cards that are hard targeting your version of or the hard targeting Chonky Red also happen to be very good against you. Things like Chandra's defeats, Fiendslayer Paladin, Lyra, etc. And one of the things this deck tried to overcome that with was by a Go Bigger package, which is basically becoming a variant of the Big Red strategy, and you lose a lot of utility to be able to hang in firefights a little bit longer. I think this version of the deck would probably have some legs if you were like to cut some of this high-end nonsense and then use like things like Chandra Acolyte of Flame, maybe a couple Chandra Torso Defiance, but still having like access to the Graveyard Hate, the better removal spells, etc. I think maybe this deck could have a decent go of things, but I do think in a format where, as I kind of discussed when we were playing this deck, you don't want to be the smaller of a two decks. So generally speaking in Magic, when there's a lower to the ground aggro deck, the next level above it is usually a little bit better, as far as like the beating the matchup. So like little red, big red, 5-color Niv, and then blue white control. Just as an example, like 4 decks going up a scale. So it doesn't necessarily pay to be the smaller aggro deck when people are hard targeting your bigger cousin, and a lot of the cards are just simply splash damage. There are certain matchups, certain metas, like if green ramp is a good thing. The format, Lotus Field Breach combo is starting to pop up. Possibly even blue white control is possibly a better matchup for these lower to the ground mono red decks. But when the mid range deck is the king of the format, when it's basically your big brother, then it really doesn't pay to run this version. This version did feel a lot weaker than playing the red version, and maybe one of the tweaks to that would be to cut the go big sideboard and actually have like a more traditional red sideboard with like a couple graveyard hates and better removal spells. Maybe a couple Chandra Acolyte of Flame, just a little bit of something to give you a little bit more mid game, but without dedicating your entire sideboard to a mid game and basically becoming a worse version of Big Red in some of the mirror matches and some of the mid range matchups, etc. They're really preying on answering your creatures quickly and letting you run out of steam. So let's hop into the next version of the deck we used. So finally, we're going to wrap up the Magic Online version of looking at decks with a version that I ended up on. This was the last league we ran. It was 4-1, probably our most successful league. Started doing some cleaning up of the other versions that we had played. First thing to note is there's only 2 Mutavaults in this list. I think Mutavault can be a great card, especially in small numbers. There were several times Mutavault was a really key card in beating up some of the control decks, adding pressure to the board, etc., while holding up removal spells, etc. So I think that's one way you can graduate to playing Chain Whirler. Still in the main deck, I think this card is a fine main deck card. I think there's some matchups where it's subpar, but much like Grapple Master, its upside in those situations is so high, you just kind of have to run it. Beyond that, you could run the 4 Mutavaults and no Goblin Chain Whirlers, maybe run something like Rampaging Frostodon. But this deck isn't terribly worried about life gain. Like, this deck deals damage in a lot higher chunks than the little red deck we were looking at. Not trying to get you from 20 to 0 as quickly as possible. It has a lot of individually powerful cards. So I honestly think it's fine to just go ahead and run Chain Whirler and a couple of Mutavaults. Sometimes you'll have those awkward draws where you can't play Chain Whirler on turn 3, but oftentimes you'll have Bone Crusher, Rabble Master, some other combination of cards. You have other things to do with your mana on turn 3, so that's not bad. The debate between Rekindling Phoenix, Hazoret, and Torbaron. I'm not completely sold that Torbaron is a worse option than Rekindling Phoenix. I think they each have different things. Torbaron allows you to close the game faster. Rekindling Phoenix allows you to grind a little bit better. So it's really kind of up to you and what your meta entails. Your meta entails a lot of Lotus Field combo, a lot of mono red or mono green ramp, where you just want to close out the game before your opponent can get their bigger threats online. Torbaron might be a better option, even Hazoret. Whereas if you're going to be playing against a lot of things like blue white control, if you're going to be playing against things like any type of red mirrors, etc., Rekindling Phoenix is a lot better, especially if your opponent's not packing things like Lava Coil and such to respect these kind of threats. And then for Glorybringer, no Embercleave just feels right. Sideboard, through some of the matchups we played, I've noticed that I wanted to bring in some Magma Sprays and Lava Coils. I just don't like losing to recurring threats. Arclight Phoenixes, any of that kind of nonsense, Rekindling Phoenix, etc. Not sure what the right split is on these removal spells, but this slate felt pretty good throughout the league. 2 Tormod's Crypts. I was normally just cutting Graveyard Hate because it didn't feel too great against Soul Flare, but there's been some other spots where having a couple random Tormod's Crypts have proven valuable, like Lotus Field combo decks. They're now trying to utilize Underworld Breach, etc. I think it's worthwhile having a couple Graveyard Hate pieces and then Obviously, the Force Chandra is kind of a slam dunk and kind of a grindier mid-range mirrors, whether it be the red mirror, whether against 4 color or 5 color nib, blue-white control, etc. This could be a really problematic card for a lot of those cards to deal with. All right. That said, let's take a look at a couple other red decks that have been doing well recently, and then a slight red deck with a slight black splash. So this is the deck that ours was largely based off of, with two Torburen. Like I said, not sure which one of those was better. I actually believe the version we played actually had a one Ember Cleave. I just kind of cleaned some stuff up. But look at a lot of the numbers are the same. The 2 Mutabolts, the 2 Castle Embereth have come in handy. 4 Rounding Up Ruins. These utility lands feels like a nice balance. Still having 17 clean mountains in your deck feels nice. Tormod's Crisp, kind of covered all of these cards. They're all pretty reasonable, except maybe Ember Cleave. This card might help you close out games faster, but just doesn't feel all that good. Difference between Sky Clan Berserker and Eidolon, once again, probably would require more testing and what you're trying to beat. Another version is by Nick Strad, gentleman who we played a lot of his Gruul decks. He's deciding to pack 4 copies of Eidolon, 4 copies of Leyline for his sideboard, and then he is also running Torbrand over Rekindling Phoenix, once again allowing you to kind of close out games faster. Other than that, he's risking running the 4 Mutabolts, but also running a 26 land. So he's a little bit less likely to get screwed on colors, but a little more likely to flood out. Deck does have some utility with its lands, but I don't know that 26 is the correct number. 25, 26. Once again, nothing up for debate. Not a huge fan of the split on the removal spells. Mizium Mortars is fine. I think I'd rather run the second Lava Coil because you're very rarely going to get to the spot where you can hold the Mizium Mortars long enough to overload it. And not a huge fan of only 2 Chandra Torch of Defiance in the 75. The final frontier I want to get into is a small black splash here. There's a couple of different cards that are worth exploring in the black splashes. This user Toyobi0440 choosing to use Ingrass Rampage, which is fine. Ingress Rampage can be relevant against Dreamcatcher? The new threat out of blue-white control, Dream Trawler, sorry. That just is very powerful. This allows you to get around its hexproof effects. Another card that could be worthwhile is something like Cut to Ribbons. The one thing you do give up to a certain degree with this is your mana base becomes a little bit more clunky. You're having to reuse things like Canyon Slew, Dragon's Call Summit. This one still managed to get in all the utility lands that we were running. It does take a little bit more damage from its mana base. It can be relevant in racing situations. No Kari-Zev in this list, but is running a little bit more removal. Ingress Rampage feels reasonable. Another one you could do is Cut to Ribbons, which is a slightly better removal spell, especially if you find yourself not using Lightning Strike to the face all that much. And then, the creatures are all largely the same. They're running 4 copies of Rekindling Phoenix. Personally, I'd probably go with a 2-4 split, but, that's just me. Sideboard, 4 copies of Rampaging Frostodon. I'm not sure that's entirely necessary, but seems reasonable. Epic Downfall is an interesting removal spell. Man costs 3 or greater, so this is thing things like Rekindling Phoenix and such. Can also hit Nib Mizzet, can also hit Siege Rhino. So the Black Splash might be worth something exploring, and then Siege Outpost is an additional, the Force Chandra. Seems reasonable. Play that card. Yeah, so this is the one you can actually use to play lands. And there was obviously Vance's Blasting Can that doesn't allow you to play lands. So Outpost Siege is kind of the most relevant there. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, Outpost Siege deals 1 damage to a creature or player. Quite ridiculous with Goblin Rabble Master. Pretty ridiculous on dragons with Kari-Zev. Tormod's Crypt and Damping Sphere here, obviously kind of respecting the Lotus Field combo. Interesting look at what you can do with the Black Splash. I don't think there's been enough exploring done with that particular thing yet. And when we do the Pioneer prelims breakdown, I will get into another version of the deck that did reasonably well, but definitely a variant of the deck that could be pretty good moving forward depending on how the format shakes out. It does give you also access to discard spells and such, which can be relevant against some of these combo decks that may not be quite fast enough to run down in the more traditional mono red variant. So let me know what you think of this rundown. Overall, I think this deck is wonderful. I enjoyed playing it. I do think that the big red version is probably better in the meta, but as I said, there are certain spots where a little red could potentially be good. Beyond that, um, need more data. Whether Eidolon's better than Scab Clan Berserker, whether Rekindling Phoenix is better than Porbron. You need more than 3 or 4 leagues to kind of figure this stuff out. But I did want to get you guys on the right path to maybe tuning this deck to be even more lethal than it already is. And it's already a very good deck in the format, able to hang in firefights with 5-color Niv and also with blue-white control, while also being fast enough to pressure Lotus Field combo to feel like a close matchup. A lot of close matchups. I don't think there's anything that's too terribly one-sided, except in those situations where Chain Whirler is like kind of a dominant force. There are some games that are runaways, but there's a lot of really, really close games with this deck. So if you like good Magic, this is definitely a good deck to take a look at. So that's it. This has been John for MTG Nexus. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and to check out the playlist with all the various leagues and such we've played with this deck, and we will be back revisit these decks in the future.